Boa tarde a todos e todas. Muito obrigado por ficarem com a gente até agora. A Clarice acabou de avisar que a gente tem... Esse painel aqui está antes do nosso coquetel, então fiquem conosco. Eu vou rapidamente entrar no inglês aqui, em respeito ao David, mas a ideia desse painel, eu fiquei muito feliz de poder moderar. A gente, desde a apresentação do Fábio, quando recebeu a gente aqui um pouco mais cedo, a gente tem ouvido uma palavrinha aqui que é planejamento. E o que a gente procurou fazer aqui foi trazer o chefe da área de Climate Change dos estudos de cenário da Shell, que é um trabalho impressionante, vocês vão ver, e um outro trabalho igualmente impressionante, que é feito por algumas pessoas, entre elas a Heloisa, que é chefe da área de estudos de petróleo, gás e biocombustíveis na EPE. So I'm going to switch into English. David, thank you so much for joining us. I've just reading your bio, and you are with Shell since 1980. 1980. It's 44 years. And so I was saying you are head of climate change for the studies of scenarios at Shell, and Heloisa is head of oil and gas and biofuels studies at the EPE, the energy planning company in Brazil. So please join me welcoming Heloisa and David. Thank you.
So I think we're just waiting for the slides to come up. Good. I'm gonna stand up here. It's a little bit easier. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the welcome here, and thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk about scenarios. We're going to talk about the future and how the future energy trends in Brazil may unfold in two different scenarios. And this work, which was done for Brazil, is based on our global energy security scenarios that were released about a year and a half ago. But this Brazil study was just released a couple of months ago. Before we start, it's just important for me to remind everybody that this is a story about the future. It's a scenario story. It's not about Shell's future. We're talking about Brazil. We're not talking about Shell's strategy or Shell's business plans. So please don't use this as a guide for investing in Shell. These scenarios are based on a recognition that there are a number of clear areas that are driving the energy system today. Actually, maybe I'll sit here. And that is that we've entered an era of energy security concerns. We're still in an era of energy growth, of growing energy demand, simply because of growing populations and rapid development. We all know about the climate issue and the fact that we're now very close to 1.5 degrees C. And of course, importantly, and we heard a little bit about it in the last panel, we're in an era of rapid technological change, particularly in the energy system. And things that we saw just a few years ago, such as in my home country, Australia, the very largest battery that was built was 100 megawatt hours. 7 years later, in California alone, they're measuring battery output in gigawatts. So fast is that transition. Now, in Shell, for over 50 years, we've used scenarios to help us think through these types of issues and to help us think about what they mean for the future. So the scenarios today are meant to make you think about the future. These are not forecasts. And there are some things that I will put up that you'll go, whoa, no, that can't possibly be right. And that's good, because it means I've challenged your thinking about where the future might be going. Now, the two scenarios that we're going to talk about are built on the very real tension that you see in the world between the longer-term goals of climate change. So, for instance, at COP26 in Glasgow, world leaders got up and they promised 1.5 degrees C, they promised deep reductions in emissions, they promised net zero in 2050. 3 months later, as Russia invaded Ukraine, those same world leaders were scrambling to manage energy prices, scrambling to see if they had enough gas in their economies or enough oil. And they were under immediate pressure, under immediate self-interest to do something for their country. So the mutual interest of, well, let's all cooperate and work together on climate, that was just out the window. And so there's a constant tension between these two shorter-term self-interest and longer-term mutual interest. And that's what we're exploring. We're exploring it through two scenarios, Sky 2050, which looks at this longer-term mutual interest world, and a second scenario called Archipelagos, which is very much rooted in national self-interest, a world of isolationism, a world of friction in trade, a world of military proliferation, a much more difficult, much more challenging world to get things done that affect the global community. And these two scenarios, called Archipelagos and Sky 2050, are what we used to develop also the Brazil story that we're going to hear about in the next few minutes. Now, both of the scenarios represent an accelerated energy transition. The security mindset doesn't slow things down. In fact, the energy security mindset at the moment is speeding things up, because countries are worried about energy prices and have suddenly recognized how high energy prices can go. In the UK, not last winter, but the winter before, the government was paying half of everybody's electricity bill, simply because the prices had got out of control and people could not afford to even turn their heating on. It was so expensive. We were paying up to $1 per kilowatt hour for electricity. So in both scenarios, you see fossil fuels start to lose market share as new technologies come into the energy system. It's not a question of if this happens, it's a question of how fast it happens. And the two scenarios explore those different rates of change. But the scenarios aren't just about the energy system. Managing CO2 at a global level is also about managing the land, ending deforestation, starting to manage agriculture differently, starting to look at reforestation opportunities, and starting to think about all these precious ecosystems like wetlands and mangroves and grasslands that have to be preserved, in part because of their huge carbon stocks. And in fact, the carbon stock potential of the land is so big that the difference between not managing it and managing it is about 600 billion tons of CO2 by the end of this century. That's about 20 years of fossil fuel production. Now, with that in mind, we're going to dive into what this means for Brazil. And the same stories are true in Brazil, but they have different implications. In the Sky 2050 scenario, this is a scenario where we think long-term about the climate change and where the world gets to net zero emissions in 2050. This is a world of partnerships for Brazil. But it's not about Brazil seeking partnerships, it's about the rest of the world wanting to partner with Brazil, because they see that the huge potential here for carbon removal and for managing carbon exceeds almost any other country. And it's in their interests to work with Brazil to realize this opportunity so that other countries can get to net zero emissions. And so this leads to an inflow of investment into Brazil. And that leads to opportunity and competition and accelerated change. In the Archipelagos scenario, you have a very different outcome. Brazil is focusing on its self-interest, what's best for Brazil. And what's best for Brazil is that the energy system's fine. It's already low carbon, not our problem. We can live with what we've got. We've got sugarcane, we've got ethanol, we've got hydroelectricity. Don't bother us. So carbon is still important, and it's an opportunity for revenue, but it's not the driver of change that it is in the Sky 2050 scenario. And in fact, one of the things that happens in Brazil is that the oil and gas industry just grows and grows, because Brazil is seen as a safe source of oil for export because of geopolitical reasons. You don't want all your eggs in the Middle East basket. That story is still as true today as it has been over the last 50 years. And so Brazil's exports grow in this story. Now, the starting point, of course, in Brazil is one of an economy that, as I just said, is already very low emissions. In fact, almost the lowest in the world in terms of the energy system. The power generation system, largely hydro. The grid integration already exists. The light-duty vehicle system runs on ethanol, and so on and so forth. Hence, what exactly is going to change? Well, a lot. And one of the things that does change, of course, is that today Brazil has quite an inequality issue. And in both these scenarios, this starts to change. And it starts to change quite quickly over the next 30 years as energy services become more widely available for everybody in the population. This doubles the GDP per capita, increases energy demand for the economy, and makes services available for many, many more people. So this becomes a key driver of change for Brazil. Now, the other starting point for Brazil is this story, which is the CO2 emission story for Brazil. Now, if I put this up for the world, it's the fossil fuels in the middle that is the biggest piece. Land use change relative to fossil fuels on a global basis is not that big. But in Brazil, the picture is completely different. Land use CO2 is by far the biggest issue here when looking at managing carbon. That's not to say that fossil fuels aren't important, but look, even the bioenergy system, although it's carbon neutral, has a bigger CO2 story in it than the fossil energy system. So it's not surprising that the transition for Brazil and the opportunities for Brazil are going to be very different to the ones that you may see in other countries or at a global level. So with that in mind, what does this transition to net zero emissions actually look like? And it covers a number of areas, not surprisingly. The transport system, how to manage land differently, where are the new opportunities, wind and solar and hydrogen? And what are the opportunities in this country for real carbon management technologies like carbon capture and storage? All of these become important. Now we start the story with primary energy. And the first thing that you see is that in both scenarios, the energy demand in Brazil is growing. Not surprising because of the spread of energy and use of energy services as the economy develops and this sort of inequality starts to equalize out. In the Sky 2050 scenario, most of that new, or in fact all of that new energy comes from wind and solar. And in fact, there's so much wind and solar is coming into this story that it's starting to drive down oil use in Brazil, drive down natural gas use in Brazil. You've got a restarting of Brazil's nuclear energy program. And the economy moves rapidly towards net zero emissions. Now, in the archipelagos scenario, quite a different story. It's in Brazil's interest and in some of its partner countries to maintain this oil and gas production, and it does. It uses that oil domestically, it uses the natural gas domestically. There's still more energy demand, and there's certainly some construction of solar and wind, but a lot of the new energy also comes from the bioenergy system because that's a secure source of supply that Brazil likes, knows, and likes to use. So two quite different storylines, even though the energy demand for both is similar. And the other big change is you start to see more and more use of electricity in Brazil. More energy services are converted to electricity, to the extent that by 2050, electricity demand more than doubles in the economy. And that happens in both scenarios, although there's two slightly different things going on. In the Sky 2050 scenario, there's rapid introduction of electricity across all of the energy services at a very high level of efficiency. In the archipelagos scenario, there's less use of electricity across energy services, but there's no real emphasis on efficiency. So these two sort of cancel out and you end up with about the same amount of electricity. But the big surprise in all of this is the blue bars that are starting to appear, that in the 2023 and 2030 are hardly anything, but by 2040 and 2050 are quite significant. And this is electrification of the transport system. Brazil is not immune and not insulated from the global push towards electrification. And this is what happens. And it happens quite quickly. And it happens not because the government wants it, and not because the government mandates it, which is certainly the case in Europe, for instance. It happens because of intense competition in this market. New entrants come in and start building electric cars, and we're seeing that today. And that triggers the incumbents to fight back. And fighting back for a company like Volkswagen in our story means shifting to electric, because after all, that's what the corporate center is doing anyway. The corporate model in Volkswagen is to move to electricity at a global level. Why would they leave Brazil as just that one place that's maintaining the internal combustion engine forever? In our story, and I emphasize that, we're not forecasting what Volkswagen are doing. In our story, everything changes. And of course, that frees up ethanol. The ethanol producers are suddenly left without a market. But in fact, that becomes an accelerating fact because they see opportunity in using ethanol for other purposes. Now, along the way, the hydrogen economy potentially develops very rapidly in Sky 2050 because there's a global push towards these technologies. But there's a lot of uncertainty about hydrogen in Brazil in our scenario stories. In archipelagos, it's really quite a small development. It's so large in the Sky 2050 story that in fact, the production of green industrial hydrogen could potentially allow Brazil to end its import dependency on nitrogen fertilizers, which are made indirectly through hydrogen. Natural gas is converted to hydrogen. Hydrogen is used to make ammonia, and that's used to make fertilizer. So quite a strong hydrogen story emerges in the Sky 2050 scenario, uncertain about archipelagos. And meanwhile, what are the biofuel producers doing? As hydrogen's taking up their role in big trucks and electricity is taking up their role in passenger vehicles, they've recognized that conversion of ethanol to jet fuel is a higher value proposition for them. And Brazil leads the world in terms of sustainable aviation fuels in that sector. By the 2060s, there's really no oil left in the aviation sector. And this is partly driven or largely driven by the position that Brazil finds itself with sustainable fuels. Now, oil and gas production, very important for companies like mine. What happens? In both scenarios, we are where we are today. New leases have gone out, new rigs are being built, production is ramping up. That continues. So for the next 10 years, you get two very similar stories emerging. And then you get a very strong divergence of stories. In the Sky 2050 scenario, there's really no further development of any scale of the oil and gas industry in Brazil, and production starts to decline quite quickly, as it does at the global level. Although Brazil certainly, the peak in Brazil is later than it is globally by quite a few years. But in archipelagos, Brazil is seen as an important producer for this part of the world. And production keeps growing and growing, and exports grow. And so by mid-century, we're over 5 million barrels per day, and it's a major export economy. And this continues for decades into the future, long after the rest of the world has peaked and is starting to see a decline in oil production. Now, as I said, the biofuel industry changes. If we start with where the biofuel industry is today, it's quite a complex story in Brazil. Not surprisingly, it's a very mature industry. You've got sugarcane and soy and corn being used to make liquid fuels, and you've got what we've called wood chips, but is the commercial biomass industry going into all sorts of industrial outlets. That starts to change quite rapidly, and by 2050, it's changed in 5 key areas. The first is that the production of ethanol from sugarcane has become much more efficient because of cellulosic processing. The second is that ethanol is being converted at scale to jet fuel, a much higher value opportunity for the ethanol producers. They're also looking and have found new markets for ethanol, going in, for instance, to the chemical industry to meet ethylene needs. The wood chip, the commercial biomass industry has diversified even further. And importantly, the export market has grown considerably, over triple what it is now, because the rest of the world needs the fuels that Brazil can produce. Now, these trends emerge in the archipelago scenario as well. So it's not one scenario yes and the other scenario no, but the time frame is quite different. In archipelagos, you barely get to double of exports by about 2050. So a real lost opportunity by just thinking about, with nations focusing on their self-interest. The big elephant in the room, of course, is land use change from a CO2 perspective. You remember, it's the biggest part of the story. And in Brazil, we know there's been a long period now of deforestation. But that is coming to an end. The government is determined to change it. And in the Sky 2050 scenario, as I said at the beginning, countries around the world want to help Brazil end it so that they can start using nature-based solutions for carbon removal through reforestation and through carbon farming changes. And so you end up with this very big change. Now, this is going from 1990, when deforestation was well underway. The discs that are appearing on the screen are the scale of these things in megahectares. And it's giving you an idea of the land area of Brazil that's been deforested. But you start to see reforestation, avoided deforestation, carbon farming techniques like biochar coming in, and large-scale preservation of wetlands and grasslands and mangroves and things. So a complete transformation in the land use story, absolutely essential in Sky 2050 for the world to get to net zero emissions, but all sorts of pressures drive it to happen in the archipelago scenario as well, but on a very different time scale. Now, all of this comes about because Brazil is building a carbon removal sector. And in fact, the building of a carbon removal sector is pivotal to this overall change. The carbon removal sector, a bit small to see, but it's very small today. It's built around the voluntary carbon market and avoided deforestation projects. And it's probably not going to expand from that if the status quo maintains. But in fact, what happens in the Sky 2050 scenario is that other governments, as I said, are partnering with Brazil to help end deforestation. This gives new credibility, a new life to the carbon market, and allows Brazil to move into reforestation and produce credits that other countries start to buy because they recognize that these are genuine removals of CO2 from the atmosphere. And in fact, this expands so quickly that by 2050, many countries are buying Brazil credits to use in their own compliance systems, such as the EU emissions trading system. And the CCS industry emerges. Today, in the Sao Paulo region, lots of ethanol facilities, they're all emitting CO2 from the fermentation step. It's pure CO2. You can capture that, dry it, and store it geologically. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, there's good geology underneath the Sao Paulo region to do this. In the Sky scenario, Brazil capitalizes on this opportunity. Credits in 10 years, just 10 years, could be worth $1 billion of export value to Brazil. That's not an opportunity that you want to pass by. But all of this depends on being able to trade carbon removals internationally. And that needs Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And that's a mechanism that is struggling today to reach agreement between partner countries. So we're coming to the end. This is about Brazil leading the world to net zero emissions. This is not just a catchy title. It's what Brazil can actually do and can realize this opportunity. And remember this picture, we're starting back at what does the CO2 picture look like today? By 2040, in the Sky 2050 scenario, Brazil can be at net zero emissions. It's not that it's got rid of fossil fuel use, it hasn't. Fossil fuel use isn't going to disappear in 15 years. But it's reversed the trends in land, it's starting to reduce fossil fuel use, it's embraced CCS technologies, new business models have emerged through carbon market trading, and the country is reaping the benefits of this situation. In the archipelagos scenario, it's another 20 years later. It still happens. Net zero CO2 emissions, we think, is in Brazil's future. It's just a question of when this happens. And the screen's a bit small to see this, unfortunately, but this is all online in the material that you can download. And it's just looking at where these scenarios land Brazil in 10 years' time. We've talked a lot about 2040 and 2050 and 2060. The short term is what the government is focusing on today because they've got to produce new nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. And this gives you some idea of where the two scenarios end up in just 10 years. So I'm going to bring it to a close. We've recognized that Brazil can reach net zero CO2 emissions, that carbon markets and carbon removals are key to that story, and they're key for other countries as well. We've seen the surprise that Brazil is not insulated from the electric car trend outside the country, and that the oil and gas market continues, but has ultimately very different pathways in the 2040s. And of course, all of this means that the biofuels market needs to change. The biofuel producers need to think about alternatives. So I'm going to end there. This is a Cobra mural that many of you may have seen in Niterói. I saw this in February as we were here talking to people about this scenario work, and I felt it really represented the goals of what we're trying to see here. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you so much, David. That's wonderful. It's my second time in the audience watching the results of your work and your teams. So, Heloisa, we were discussing previously, and the question is, by the way, I don't know how they do planning in this country, energy planning, because a lot of what David was saying, so for example, CCUS, we have legislation to come. We don't have it yet. And likewise with the carbon markets. As you know, we are going towards the cap and trade system that you use in Europe and elsewhere. So there's nothing new. We're simply adapting to our legal system, but we don't have it yet. We are very close to it, but we don't have it as much as we don't have the CCUS. There are some elements of your scenario. Just as a Brazilian, I'm a bit skeptical about I was mentioning to you, the EVs. I think a lot of what's happening here is due to the oversupply in China, but more than us in Brazil being keen or in love with the EVs. But anyways, the question is for you, is how do you do and what are the synergies on what you've seen on David's work and looking forward to our planning?
Well, thank you. It's my second time watching this as well. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, David. And it's important to understand, and David mentioned it right in the beginning, but I will repeat, scenarios are not projections. A scenario is a tool to understand what the future could look like. I'll make it easier for you. I hope everybody is a fan of Marvel as I am. Marvel works a lot with the idea of different timelines in the Loki series, for instance, or different universes. What are different visions of the future? What we do when we use scenarios is try to understand and consolidate different visions of the future. Those are not projections. They are there to help us make decisions. They help companies make decisions, and they help government make decisions. And so it's not written in stone. It's something that identifies trends, technological trends, price trends, and help us identify the risks and help us, I hope, make better informed decisions. Because of that, because they represent visions of the future, they're not supposed to be the same. That's why trends are the same, but the numbers are hardly the same, because they depend on modeling, they depend on how you think technology will evolve, they'll depend on prices, and they'll depend on lots of assumptions. But we can identify common tendencies, common trends. What we see in all scenarios, and David showed really well, fossil fuels phase down. If we are really, really, really committed about fighting climate change, market share for fossil fuels, it's not if, it's how fast, but it does not reach zero. The limit depends on three main sectors: transportation, industry, and something that we don't talk about often, petrochemicals. Your assumptions on petrochemicals and how fast you can move from hydrocarbon petrochemicals to any substitute, usually bio-based, is precisely, it's almost what represents the main differences between the main scenarios. Will we reach 20 million barrels per day of oil globally in 2050, 35, 60, 80? Transportation comes down. The other sectors, that's the challenge. If we look at transportation, we see common trends. Biofuels grow a lot. How much? Depends on your scenario. Electromobility advances a lot. How much? It depends on the scenario. In our scenarios, we see not what we call BEV, electric battery vehicles, but hybrid vehicles growing faster and being the main technological trend instead of BEV vehicles. That accounts for a difference in electricity demand in the end, but it's there. Road transportation, so heavy vehicles. How much of it is biomethane? How much is just HVO because you don't have enough money to substitute the fleet? So if you do not change the trucks and you still want to lower emissions, you substitute the fuel and then you move to HVO or any other bio-based fuel instead of going with an electric truck. Same thing with buses. So the difference with the scenarios is the difference in your assumptions. We did something very interesting for Brazil. We built and we published last year 3 energy transition scenarios for 1.5 degrees. So 3 net zero scenarios for Brazil. Just to show that there are multiple ways to reach net zero. It's hard, it's not an easy task, but we showed 3. One we saw as cost efficient for Brazil, One alternative scenario, what if something goes wrong? Again, with Marvel has a great series on what ifs. What if everybody turns zombie? It's one of the what ifs. So what if something goes wrong? What do we do? And there's a very interesting scenario that we call global transition that shows Brazil's potential to provide services to the world, to go beyond its own targets in order to help other countries achieve net zero, and then carbon markets are essential. Article 6 is fundamental. One thing I want to connect is with energy planning. For us, building scenarios is a fundamental tool to help us adjust, and as any country should, help us adjust the route. We have some part of my team here. I thank them very much. The smart questions you should make to them, please. So if you have something difficult to ask, I'll refer you to the specialists. But one thing that's very interesting is that if you put the numbers, you get anxiety. And at the beginning of the G20 meetings, at some point, the debate was so heated that someone said, okay, how do you think this will happen? A magic wand? Magically, in 2035, we will do that? We're not doing it. We're not getting there. And the answer is yes. How do you do? What do you need to adjust? What legislation do you need to pass? Not because everything's lost, but we have to adjust our course because the world is changing. I don't know if I'm also a Star Trek fan, and I hope you've seen the movie because otherwise you won't get the joke. But in the Star Trek Generations movie, right in the end, if you haven't seen, I'm sorry, but right in the end, there's a planet is exploding. And they're testing the technology that later on the series, but Star Trek Generation goes back in time. And at that point, they hadn't figured out the whole teletransportation thing. And the younger Scott, he was trying to figure out the equations to zap everyone back to the ship because the planet was exploding. You had to get everybody out. And the older Spock, he said, move out. And he did it. And he said, okay, what did you do? He said, you were accounting, your math was right, but you forgot to account that everything was moving. The ship was moving, the universe was moving, the planet was moving. So you were doing the math for a static view. Then things change. Everything moves. That's what happens with the scenarios. At some point, we do the math. It's a photograph. But the world keeps changing. The Ukraine war happens. Things will change, and you have to keep adjusting your course in order to reach the goal. That's what we do in energy planning, to answer your question. After doing Marvel and Star Trek quotes, that's what we do in energy planning. We think, given the several views of the future possible, what should we do to get results in 5, in 10, in 15, in 30 years? Not because I know I will be right. Of course, if I look back in the past, the numbers are not correct. I want to get right the tendency. We have to understand tendencies and adjust the course. So we are betting a lot on biofuels, but associated with carbon capture. What happens if technology does not evolve? What do we do? How do we shift course? We hope hydrogen plays a part in energy transition. What happens if we don't scale up as fast as we need? Of course, batteries play a role in compensating for an increasingly renewable energy system. What happens if it doesn't? So we have to keep readdressing, and that's why we always have a 10-year plan, which is more like a medium term. 10 years, a very actually fixed course. It's hard to shift something countrywide in very few years. And we have a 30-year plan. In the 30-year plan, we try to analyze that. In fact, I'll give you a spoiler. We have narrowed down our scenarios to 5 scenarios for the 2055. It is so hard with so many moving targets that we reached 5. We will probably not have the numbers for 5. We have the stories for 5, but we will probably have the numbers for 3. Because as David might tell you, modeling a scenario, it's kind of hard. But a last point I want to make is that a key point in scenarios, and David pointed that out, it's interesting that let's see, the worst case scenario is called archipelagos. It's a fragmented world. It's a individual world. It's a self-centered world. And fighting climate change and reaching net zero is a collaborative game. It's not a competitive game. We'll have to shift from a competitive mindset to a collaborative mindset. And we'll have to enable countries to do that. And I think I'm out of time, but that's why, and I always say that, but I keep talking. That's why in the G20, one of the main, in the Energy Transitions Working Group, Brazil proposed 3 priorities. The first one is financing the energy transition. And we tried to move away from the whole debate on actually the blame game on who has to pay for what. And we tried to build a consensus on creating capacities for countries to lower their capital cost and to actually being able to be more efficient in what they invest towards transition. And we do it by proposing a global alliance on energy planning. Because building capacity on energy planning, it's fundamental for countries to understand these different perspectives, these different possibilities, and building their scenarios by themselves. Thank you.
David, unless you have any comments on Heloisa's...
I did have one comment, actually, and it was about the collaboration and competition. So we've got a slightly different take on that. We see the world as becoming more and more competitive. And for instance, it's this competitive change that drives the electric cars in Brazil. But it's competition in the spirit of a sporting event, right? So in a sporting event or in a game of any sort, you collaborate to set the rules. And then you go out on the field and you just want to win. And I think that's healthy. So it's both of those things. The collaboration comes first because you want the rules. And this is like, you know, the Doha round of the World Trade Agreement. It's struggling because there's a lot of self-interest going on. Change those, and it's like Article 6. It's struggling because it's self-interest. Collaboration is needed to set the rules, but once you've got a trading agreement in place, you want people to compete. And so both of these things are important. But I agree with you about collaboration, but there's a slight nuance there.
But it's actually a good one, because if we think of another proposition that Brazil made, it's leveling up the debate on carbon accounting.
Yep.
We have to reach consensus on the parameters of carbon accounting. If we do mean to advance on Article 6 and allow for this healthy competition to happen, we have to all play by the same rules.
That's right, exactly. Yes, that's where the collaboration comes in.
It reminds me that it's like what we're having tonight. We agreed on the rules, but we want to win.
Yes. But you have to play on the same field with the same goal and with the same rules.
Yes. So I have plenty of questions here, but I think I'm going to pass on to the audience if anybody has any questions.
How you guys view the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, playing in terms of collaboration versus utilization of this mechanism as an import-export competition?
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it. So the economists love it because economists like things like that. And I'm not an economist, so I can, our chief economist will probably kill me for saying this, but nevertheless, it almost points to failure in itself. Because if all of the world was moving along the sort of the Sky 2050 trajectory or the 1.5 trajectory, and all of the countries had, whether it's like the EU, but some sort of carbon mechanism, or they had some sort of mandates, or at least, but they were all reducing emissions, then you wouldn't need it. The fact that you do need it is really illustrative of the fact that the system is not delivering on what you want. So then you have Europe building a carbon fortress to protect its industries, and it just seems self-defeating in my mind. It's a good economic structure. As I said, the economists love it, and apologies to any economists in the room, but I get why they like it. It's very clear. It may have the effect of getting some countries to improve their rate of decarbonisation, but I find it slightly self-defeating, unfortunately.
And again, we go back to the
That's
point.
That's a personal view.
And we go back to the point of carbon accounting, because even the CBAM, the problem with carbon accounting nowadays is that it's a political debate disguised as a technical debate. Because if we take, like the GREET model in the US, for one fuel, you get 5 numbers, depending on the assumptions. The International Energy Agency, for one fuel, you get 3 numbers. It's not, it's a calculator. As any calculators, it depends on the assumptions. And if you tweak the assumptions, you artificially change the game. So one of the problems with CBAM, it's a fine idea. You look and you say, there's a carbon leakage. You see, carbon, more pollutant industries. I'm imposing a cost in my industrial sector that other countries are not. So my industries mainly are losing competitiveness, and I try to compensate that with the CBAM. It looks okay, but then you have 2 problems. The first one, it only works for countries and industries that export to Europe. In the end, there is a great risk of just getting higher prices in the European countries, and that will create a political problem for those countries, and that causes concerns on the long-term sustainability sustainability of the policy itself. Because if we look at it from a political science point of view, it doesn't seem sustainable in time. The other problem is, if you look at the CBAM, there are some choices, political choices, to give privileges to certain technologies. And again, it's when you choose winners, you might lose, you might bet on the wrong horse, so it's a problem. Again, the third one, if we advance on Article 6, we wouldn't need CBAM. If we advance globally on our targets, we won't need it, because everybody will be doing its own targets. It's a global problem.
And Peixoto, you know this, that we know by experience that the glass half full is that the industry, the companies that are within the industry, so-called hard to abate, they are working harder on the process because they are exporters, and CBAM will kick in, I think, in 26. So perhaps we can question the utility and etc. But there is a nice piece on this. The companies are working harder than perhaps they would.
But I'll pose you a question. If we are really interested in paying a green premium, and Brazil has 93% of renewable energy in its electricity grid, why are they not coming? If we are really paying a green premium, where are these off-takers of this green premium?
The problem is that this CBAM has a date to start getting in effect. And there is a time bomb if it doesn't get clarified or reversed, it's going to be in place in 2026.
Any further questions? Fabio?
Thank you very much for the presentation, for the words. David, we talked about it in the past, I remember, a lot about governance. Because, you know, Heloisa, there's planning. So the planners, they do energy planning, they correct the course over time in the changing world, right? Changing frame. But that needs to be implemented, right? So we have a regulatory and political system to implement it, not only in Brazil, but also worldwide. Could you offer, it's going to be quite an open question, could you offer some insights, some comments about some good practices that are in place, not only in Brazil, but also worldwide, on governance, you know, going from planning to implementation? I know it's not an easy question, but the picture is quite fragmented at the moment. But if there are any, could you provide it to us? I don't know if it's clear, but...
Yeah, it's just a bit complicated. I think certainly in the early days of the EU emissions trading system, which is where Brazil is today, I think one of the highlights of that development was the simplicity of the program and the rapidity of implementation, which was a great example of governance. It was early 2002, I think, that the Commission, or late 2001, the Commission tabled the first draft of the directive. By 2005, it was running. And that was remarkable. But it was because it was simple. And it was probably also because it was early days for emissions trading, and it didn't have 10,000 experts in the room, which is unfortunately what Article 6 has now. Article 6 is a dreadful example of governance. It's a very clear and simple idea that's implemented in the Paris Agreement. 10 years later, they're still negotiating it. That's terrible. You know, that is bad practice. So, you know, there are good examples, and I think governments can get their act together and do these things. And I think that's really where Brazil sits now. They've got this emissions trading system sitting between the House and the Senate. They've got to get that through, but really the key thing is not to then take 10 years to write the regulations to implement it. They've got to do that within 2 or 3 years at the most. And I think they can, but that's going to be a real example. And I think organizations like the one that's here today and are really going to have to help the government do that. Because if we're still sitting here in 2035 waiting for the government to write the regulation, then there's no chance of this net zero emissions and all the other things that and all the opportunities that go with it.
Well, I fully agree. I'll just add, we do have good examples. The Renova Bio is a good example of an idea that worked, a governance scheme that worked in one sector for one specific goal, but it did work. So the law was fast to pass. It was very rapidly implemented. And one key aspect, and it was different for Brazil, is that you didn't, we refused, actually I think the law said that, it was impossible to keep changing the time frame. The law passed in 2017, it had to be implemented in 2019, period. No extra time, no rerun, it had to. It was. And then 2020, it was the COVID. What do? Doesn't matter, it's there. So it's a credible policy. It's a good mechanism. I would add, and why do we think that international negotiations always take time? And one of the aspects that we see in a fragmented world in our scenarios is actually the governance. If we cannot build consensus in the governance, it's a very important aspect. We will not reach our goals. But why is it so difficult? Because you negotiate in the international level, and then you have to internalize in each country. And each country has its own perspectives, its own particularities regarding the democratic process, the particular negotiations. We see that in Brazil, but it happens all over the world. And those things take time. I think probably we need to speak up in the sense that we do not have that much time. So maybe we should kind of fast track the internal, not bypass, but give us senses of urgency to legislators around the world to internalize and build internal consensus in each country around their goals.
Good.
Here.
I think we
I
have.
think I have one more here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Heloisa, David. Congratulations for the panel, very good. Rodolfo from Rule Advisors. I'll change a little bit the topics of the two last questions. I'm going to change to nuclear. So based on scenarios and your views, what's the role of nuclear as we see like big players like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, eager to learn more about that and invest on those energies, and the role of nuclear for Brazil and worldwide, David, in general?
So I can speak from our scenario perspective, because in the scenarios I just showed, in fact, in both of them, the nuclear industry in Brazil starts to get going again. But particularly in the Sky 2050 scenario, it accelerates quite quickly, as it does globally. And that's simply because the world needs it. It needs the zero carbon energy sources. It needs some sources that are non-intermittent. Even with lots of grid batteries, you still need some non-intermittent sources. And nuclear has a renaissance, both in Brazil and at a global level. And in the scenario, we assumed, again, from a scenario perspective, that this was on the back of the modularization of nuclear in small modular reactors, and that these are produced much faster and much more effectively than these giant nuclear projects. That's a technology that is there. There's a lot of money going into it. There's a lot of people that think it's very promising. There's a few big companies starting to actually build these modules, like Rolls-Royce in the UK. But it could just as easily come to a standstill because there's also people that don't want it. And often the same people that don't want it are the same people that want net zero emissions and no fossil fuels. And they leave the world with very few opportunities on the table. But anyway, so that's what happens in the scenarios. You have to have it. And I think, small modular reactors are one of these things that, one of the big outstanding questions, and it's not the global game-changing event, but the shipping industry needs to change. It could easily run on, nuclear is ideal for an industry like shipping. Is it ever going to get there? Oh, probably not. But, the US military run many ships on nuclear, and it's a very successful technology, but it's never made its way into the commercial area in the way that it potentially should to deliver zero carbon sectors.
I'll just add that nuclear, especially SMRs, is one of those technologies with a disruptive role in the scenarios. If they grow fast enough, they give a solution. If they stop because of social license to operate or anything else, then we have a problem. Because energy demand keeps growing, so we have to balance the system. We have to balance the model at some point. Batteries are another one, combinations of technologies. The thing with nuclear, David pointed out a very interesting thing about the US Navy. Nuclear is good from an emissions point of view, but it was not because it's not there because of emissions. It's there because of security, national security, technological control of a technological path. And we think about energy, and we are talking about energy from a sustainability point of view, but a security point of view, it's very important as well, and affordability as well. And nuclear plays a huge, nuclear meets all those three aspects. But still, we are seeing lots of countries dephasing nuclear because of the social license to operate this technology. And again, it depends on political choices of each country. Policy choices, not political, policy choices of each country. If you do not want nuclear, okay, but as David said, you need something to balance your grid. Then you have to find something else. It's hydrogen, yes, but hydrogen is not the primary source of energy. You need something to produce hydrogen. Of course, Paulo Emilio already left. But natural hydrogen is not something that it's starting, but it's not something that's there yet. How much do we have? From a geological perspective, we are still studying. We are still mapping. Is it enough? It could be. It could be.
I think the other thing about nuclear is ultimately it's where we end up. And I'm surprised you didn't use a Star Trek analogy there, because a lot of the people who are fans of wind and solar, which are great technologies, imagine a world that uses less and less energy. Oh, it all just becomes more and more efficient. Do you really, for those of you who watch science fiction, do you really think in the 22nd century they're using less energy than today? The Enterprise uses more energy than the entire planet does today. Yeah, that's the world we're heading into, whether we have travel or interstellar travel or not. We're going to use more energy. We'll think of something to do with it. And you know, we're going to need enormous high-density sources of energy to provide that world of the future. We don't need it today. It would be nice to have it today, but I think it's where we end up. Anyway.
Very good analogy. Thank you.
I'm also a fan of Star Trek and the Marvel series. Right, maybe we should go for the drink now.
Yeah, I'm afraid that we have to close. We have to close. Yeah, we have to close. So this was brilliant. Thank you so much.